The warrior charges through the Roman line, foam streaming from his mouth, his eyes rolled back until only the whites show. Arrows pierce his chest, sword cuts open his arms, but he doesn't slow down. He doesn't even seem to notice. The Roman soldiers who moments before stood in perfect formation now scatter like leaves before a storm, screaming in terror as this single man cuts through them like they're made of straw. This isn't a man anymore. This is something else entirely, something that has transcended pain, fear, and human limitation through sheer controlled madness. This is the story of the Berserkers, the most feared warriors in human history, men who discovered how to weaponize rage itself, transforming from ordinary Norse farmers and traders into living instruments of terror that would haunt battlefields across Europe for centuries. In the harsh fjords of Scandinavia, where survival meant strength and weakness meant death, Norse society forged a warrior culture unlike anything the world had seen. But even among these battle-hardened people, the Berserkers stood apart. They weren't born monsters, they were made. The path to becoming a Berserker began in childhood. Young boys showing exceptional aggression or unusual tolerance for pain were marked for special training. These weren't the sons of jarls or wealthy merchants. They were often outcasts, orphans, or those deemed too wild for normal society. The very qualities that made them unsuitable for peaceful life made them perfect candidates for transformation into living weapons. The ritual transformation began with the bear. In Norse mythology, the bear represented Odin's fury, the primal rage that could overcome any enemy. Initiates would hunt and kill a massive bear with nothing but crude weapons, often sustaining terrible injuries in the process. Those who survived would skin the beast and wear its pelt as their second skin. This wasn't just ceremonial dress, it was psychological conditioning, teaching the warrior to think like a predator, to embrace the animal within. Sacred ceremonies followed, conducted in remote groves under the guidance of priests devoted to Odin. The initiates would fast for days, weakening their bodies until their minds became susceptible to the rituals that would remake them. They learned to invoke Odin's fury through meditation, chanting, and practices that pushed them beyond normal human consciousness. Some consumed sacred mushrooms that altered their perception of reality. Others underwent scarification rituals that taught them to welcome pain as a friend, rather than fear it as an enemy. The training methods were brutal beyond imagination. Berserkers in training would fight with real weapons, accepting permanent injury as the price of perfection. They learned to ignore wounds that would cripple ordinary men. They practiced fighting while injured, while exhausted, while their bodies screamed for mercy. Pain became meaningless. Fear became foreign. Death became welcome. This wasn't random brutality. It was systematic psychological conditioning designed to create warriors who could access superhuman abilities through controlled madness. They learned to trigger massive adrenaline releases at will, flooding their systems with natural chemicals that increased strength, speed, and pain tolerance, while reducing their perception of danger. They trained their minds to disconnect from their bodies during combat, allowing them to fight effectively even with mortal wounds. The religious significance ran deeper than mere warrior training. These men weren't just soldiers. They were Odin's chosen, warriors who sought death in battle as the ultimate honor. In Norse belief, only those who died fighting could enter Valhalla, the hall of the slain where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. For Berserkers, Every battle was a chance at eternal glory. Death wasn't something to be avoided. It was something to be earned through spectacular violence. The transformation from ordinary man to legendary killer required years of systematic brutalization. The process stripped away everything human except the capacity for violence. Family ties were severed. Personal desires were eliminated. Even their names were often abandoned, replaced by titles that reflected their new nature. They became living embodiments of war itself. But this came at a terrible cost. Many initiates didn't survive the training. Others emerged so damaged they could never return to normal society. They became creatures of the battlefield, unable to function in peacetime, living only for the next opportunity to unleash their carefully cultivated rage. They were weapons forged from human souls, and like all weapons, they were designed for one purpose: to kill. The Norse had created something unprecedented in human warfare. Not just better soldiers, but warriors who had transcended the normal limitations of fear, pain, and mortality through the systematic cultivation of controlled madness. They had turned rage into a science. The preparation began hours before battle in sacred groves hidden from ordinary eyes. The berserkers would gather in circles, their bare pelts draped over shoulders still scarred from countless fights. What happened next would transform them from dangerous men into something that transcended human limitation entirely. The ceremonies started with the consumption of sacred substances. Some historians believe they used AMANITA muscaria mushrooms, the red-capped fungi that grew wild in Scandinavian forests. Others consumed fermented drinks mixed with unknown herbs that induced altered states of consciousness. But the substances were only the beginning. The real transformation came through ritualized meditation and chanting that could last for hours. They would bite their shields until their teeth cracked and their mouths filled with blood. The metallic taste triggered something primal in their minds, a conditioned response built through years of training. They howled like wolves, roared like bears, and worked themselves into a frenzy that bordered on possession. Witnesses described foam gathering at the corners of their mouths as their breathing became rapid and shallow. The physical transformation was terrifying to behold. Their pupils dilated until their eyes became black holes. Veins bulged in their necks and forearms as their heart rate soared. Their skin flushed red with increased blood flow, making them appear almost demonic in the flickering light of torches. Some trembled uncontrollably as massive doses of adrenaline flooded their systems. Others became eerily still, like predators preparing to strike. But the most disturbing change was the complete absence of normal human emotion from their faces. Fear vanished. Doubt disappeared. Pain became meaningless. They entered a state that modern science recognizes as a form of dissociative trance, where the mind separates from the body's normal responses to injury and exhaustion. Their brains essentially rewired themselves for pure violence. Eyewitness accounts from various sources describe berserkers in this state as no longer fully human. They would gnaw on their shield rims until wood splintered between their teeth. They howled and barked like wild animals, making sounds no human throat should produce. Some would tear at their own flesh with their fingernails, drawing blood without seeming to notice. They became creatures of pure aggression, focused on nothing but the coming slaughter. The science behind their transformation reveals how they achieved seemingly superhuman abilities. The massive adrenaline release increased their strength by up to 30%, while flooding their systems with natural painkillers more powerful than morphine. Their perception of time slowed, allowing them to react within human speed. Their pain receptors essentially shut down, letting them fight effectively even with mortal wounds. Endorphins surged through their bloodstreams, creating a natural high that made them feel invincible. Their breathing patterns changed, hyperventilating in a way that altered the chemistry of their blood and brain. Some historians believe they achieved a state similar to what modern soldiers call combat high, but amplified far beyond normal human experience through systematic conditioning and chemical enhancement. Maintaining this state during combat required incredible mental discipline. The Berserkers learned to sustain their rage through the chaos of battle, feeding their fury with each enemy they killed. They trained to recognize the signs of the trance fading and new techniques to reignite their madness even in the middle of fighting. Some would bite themselves or reopen old wounds to maintain the flow of adrenaline and endorphins. The psychological impact on enemies was often more devastating than their physical prowess. Imagine facing an army and suddenly seeing these foam-mouthed, howling creatures charging toward you. They moved differently than normal soldiers, with jerky, animal-like motions that seemed unnatural. They made sounds that chilled the blood. Most terrifying of all, they showed no reaction to wounds that should have dropped them instantly. Enemy morale often shattered before the fighting even began. Seasoned warriors who had faced countless battles would break and run when they saw berserkers entering their trance state. The sight of men transforming into something inhuman through sheer will and conditioning was more than most could bear. The berserkers understood this perfectly. Their pre-battle rituals weren't just preparation for combat. They were psychological warfare designed to win battles before the first blow was struck. This was controlled madness, refined into an art form, a systematic method of transcending human limitation through the weaponization of rage itself. September 25th, 1066. The morning mist rises from the River Derwent in Yorkshire as King Harald Godwinson's army approaches Stamford Bridge. They've marched north at breakneck speed to confront the Norwegian invasion led by Harald Hardrada and the exiled English Prince Tostig. The English expect a hard fight, but they don't expect what they're about to witness. The bridge itself is narrow, built of timber and stone, spanning the swift-flowing river. It's the only crossing point for miles, making it a natural choke point. Harald Hardrada's forces are caught off guard, many still without their armor, scattered across both sides of the river after their victory at Fulford just days before. But as the English army approaches, one figure moves to block their path. A single Norwegian warrior strides onto the bridge. He's massive, even by Viking standards, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seem to span the width of the narrow crossing. His two-handed battle axe gleams in the morning light, its blade worn from countless battles, but it's not his size that makes the English soldiers hesitate. It's his eyes. The berserker has already entered his trance state. Foam flecks his beard, his pupils are dilated black pools, and he moves with the jerky, predatory motions of a man no longer fully human. He plants himself in the center of the bridge and begins his war cry, a sound that echoes across the water like the howl of some primeval beast. The English advance guard, confident in their numbers, charges forward. The bridge can only accommodate 3 men abreast, funneling them directly into the berserkers' killing zone. His axe sweeps in massive arcs, each swing carrying enough force to cleave a man in half. The first English soldier's shield splinters like kindling. The second loses his head in a spray of blood that paints the bridge timbers crimson. The third stumbles backwards screaming as the axe blade opens his chest to the bone. More English soldiers press forward, but the bridge becomes a nightmare of death. The berserker's weapon moves in patterns that seem impossible for a human arm to execute. He spins, ducks, and strikes with inhuman speed and precision. Bodies begin to pile up on the narrow span, creating obstacles that slow the English advance while providing the warrior with higher ground from which to rain down death. What makes this stand legendary isn't just the killing, but the berserker's complete immunity to injury. English spears pierce his arms and legs, but he doesn't slow down. Sword cuts open gashes across his torso, yet he continues fighting as if the wounds don't exist. Blood streams down his body, mixing with the foam at his mouth, but his strength never wavers. He has transcended pain itself. For hours, the bridge becomes a slaughterhouse. The narrow crossing that should have allowed the English to overwhelm the Norwegian position instead becomes their doom. Harald Godwinson's entire advance is stopped by one man who has weaponized madness itself. English soldiers who have fought in dozens of battles find themselves paralyzed by terror as they watch their comrades cut down by what seems more demon than human. The psychological impact spreads through the English ranks. Seasoned warriors begin to whisper that they're facing something supernatural, a creature sent by the Norse gods to protect their people. Some refuse to advance onto the bridge at all. Others charge forward only to freeze when they see the berserker's foam-flecked face and those terrible, inhuman eyes. The bodies pile higher. The bridge timbers become slick with blood, making footing treacherous for anyone trying to cross. The berserker uses the corpses as weapons, hurling them at advancing English soldiers, or using them as shields against spear thrusts. His two-handed axe never stops moving, creating a barrier of death that no amount of courage can breach. But even berserker rage has limits. As the hours pass, the warrior begins to show signs of exhaustion. His movements, while still deadly, become slightly less fluid. The wounds he's ignored throughout the battle finally start to take their toll. Blood loss weakens him, though he shows no sign of acknowledging his mortality. The English, desperate to break the stalemate, devise a cunning plan. While the berserker focuses on the soldiers charging across the bridge, a small group of English warriors floats downstream in a barrel, hidden beneath the wooden span. They emerge directly below the warrior's position, their spears thrust upward through gaps in the bridge timbers. The attack comes from an angle the berserker never anticipated. Even in his trance state, even with his superhuman pain tolerance, the spears driven up through the bridge planks find their mark. Multiple points pierce his body from below, wounds that not even berserker conditioning can ignore. But his death is as legendary as his stand. Even mortally wounded, even with spears protruding from his body, the warrior continues fighting. He kills 2 more English soldiers before finally collapsing, his massive frame crashing onto the blood-soaked timbers he defended with such ferocious determination. The bridge is finally clear, but the damage is done. One man has delayed an entire army for hours, allowing Harald Hardrada's scattered forces time to regroup and prepare for battle. The English have won the crossing, but at a cost that will echo through military history. They've witnessed what happens when human rage is refined into a weapon, when madness becomes method, when one man transcends the normal limitations of mortality through sheer controlled fury. Word of what happened at Stamford Bridge spread like wildfire across medieval Europe, but it was just one story among hundreds. For over 2 centuries, Viking longships had carried these living weapons to every corner of the continent, and wherever they landed, the legend of the Berserkers grew darker and more terrifying. The raids began in the late 8th century, when Norse warriors first struck the monastery at Lindisfarne. But it wasn't just the surprise attack that traumatized the monks who survived. It was the sight of warriors who fought like rabid beasts, foam streaming from their mouths as they carved through defenders who had never seen anything like controlled madness weaponized for war. Frankish chronicles from the 9th century describe encounters with these mad warriors in terms that sound more like accounts of demonic possession than military engagements. One chronicler wrote of Vikings who howled like wolves and bit their shields, fighting without mail coats, and were as mad as dogs or wolves. Another described warriors who neither fire nor iron could harm. Men who seemed to feel no pain even as swords opened terrible wounds across their bodies. The psychological impact was devastating. Christian kingdoms across Europe had developed sophisticated military tactics based on disciplined formations and coordinated attacks. Their soldiers were trained to fight as units, relying on mutual support and organized retreats when necessary. But berserkers shattered these careful plans through pure, unbridled violence that followed no recognizable pattern. Imagine you're a Frankish soldier standing in a shield wall, confident in your training and the men beside you. Suddenly, creatures that barely look human charge directly into your formation, screaming like animals, their weapons moving in impossible arcs. They absorb wounds that should kill them instantly and keep fighting. Your carefully maintained formation collapses as men flee in terror from opponents who seem to have transcended mortality itself. The reputation began to precede the warriors. Coastal settlements would empty at the first sight of dragon-proud ships on the horizon, not just because of Viking raids, but because of whispered stories about the foam-mouthed berserkers who accompanied them. Parents would threaten disobedient children with tales of the mad Norsemen who felt no pain and showed no mercy. Christian kingdoms adapted their tactics, but slowly and at great cost. They learned to use crossbows and other ranged weapons to try to bring down berserkers before they could close to melee range. Some developed specialized formations designed to channel and contain the fury of individual warriors rather than meeting them head-on. Others relied on fortified positions that could funnel attackers into killing zones where numbers could overwhelm even superhuman rage. But the berserkers weren't just random killers. They served as elite shock troops in Viking armies, carefully deployed at crucial moments to shatter enemy morale and break defensive lines. A Viking commander might hold his berserkers in reserve until the perfect moment, then unleash them at the weakest point in an enemy formation. The psychological impact was often more valuable than their actual combat effectiveness. The story spread faster than the Vikings themselves, growing more terrifying with each telling. A berserker who killed 10 men became a monster who slaughtered 50. Warriors who showed unusual pain tolerance became creatures immune to all weapons. The line between reality and legend blurred until the mere mention of berserkers could cause panic in seasoned troops. Monasteries across Europe recorded encounters with these warriors, their scribes struggling to find words to describe something that seemed to exist outside normal human experience. They wrote of men who raged like wild beasts and foamed at the mouth like mad dogs. Some described them as demons sent by pagan gods to punish Christian lands. Others saw them as proof that the end times were approaching. The terror wasn't limited to battlefields. Berserkers who survived raids often struggled to return to normal consciousness, remaining in their trance state for hours or even days after fighting ended. They would continue their rampage through captured settlements, unable to distinguish between enemies and civilians, their minds still locked in the killing fury that made them so effective in combat. This created a feedback loop that amplified their legend. Survivors of Viking raids didn't just report military defeats. They told stories of inhuman monsters who killed without reason or restraint, creatures that seemed to exist solely to spread death and terror. These accounts, recorded by monks and chroniclers, became the foundation of a legend that would outlive the warriors themselves. The Berserker reputation became a weapon in itself, a form of psychological warfare that could win battles before they began. Enemy armies would sometimes retreat rather than face opponents they believed to be supernatural. The mere possibility that berserkers might be present in a Viking force was enough to break the morale of defenders who had never actually seen them fight. By the early 11th century, the terror that had spread across Europe began to take an unexpected turn. The same warriors who had struck fear into the hearts of Christian kingdoms found themselves in the service of the most sophisticated empire of their age. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, had discovered something remarkable. Berserker fury could be harnessed, controlled, and directed with devastating effectiveness. Harald Hardrada, the future king of Norway, led the way. After years of raiding across Europe, he arrived in Constantinople around 1034 with a band of elite Norse warriors, many of them berserkers who had survived countless battles across the known world. But these weren't the wild raiders who had terrorized monasteries and coastal settlements. These were seasoned veterans who had learned to channel their rage with surgical precision. The Byzantine Emperor welcomed them into the Varangian Guard, his personal bodyguard unit composed entirely of Northern European warriors. The Byzantines had a genius for taking foreign military traditions and adapting them to their own purposes. They saw in the berserkers not just mad killers, but weapons that could be aimed with imperial precision at the enemies of the empire. The transformation was remarkable. Warriors who had once charged naked into battle, howling like beasts, now wore the finest armor Constantinople could provide. Their traditional bear pelts were replaced with silk-lined mail hauberks and gleaming helmets marked with imperial eagles. But beneath the civilized exterior, the capacity for controlled madness remained intact, ready to be unleashed at the emperor's command. The berserkers adapted to their new role with surprising effectiveness. They learned Byzantine military protocols, studied the empire's enemies, and integrated their individual fury into larger tactical frameworks. But they never lost their essential nature. When the moment came for battle, they could still access that primal rage that had made them legends across Europe. The Mediterranean became their new hunting ground. Byzantine campaigns in Sicily, southern Italy, and the Holy Land gave these warriors opportunities to perfect their craft against entirely new types of enemies. They faced Arab cavalry in the deserts of Syria, Norman knights in the hills of Sicily, and Bulgarian infantry in the Balkans. Each enemy required different tactics, but the core of Berserker effectiveness remained unchanged: the ability to transcend normal human limitations through weaponized madness. In Sicily, Harald Hardrada's berserkers faced Arab forces that relied on mobility and ranged attacks. The traditional berserker charge had to be adapted for enemies who would retreat rather than stand and fight. They learned to use their rage in short, controlled bursts, breaking enemy formations before withdrawing to regroup. The sight of foam-mouthed Norsemen emerging from disciplined Byzantine formations was more than most Arab commanders could comprehend. The clash of cultures created something entirely new in military history. Norse fury met Byzantine discipline, and the result was more effective than either tradition alone. The berserkers provided the shock value and individual prowess that could shatter enemy morale, while Byzantine organization gave them strategic direction and logistical support. They became the ultimate fusion of barbarian effectiveness and civilized sophistication. But the empire demanded more than just battlefield prowess. As the emperor's personal bodyguards, these warriors had to master the complex protocols of the Byzantine court. They learned to control their rage not just in battle, but in the presence of diplomats, bishops, and foreign ambassadors. The same men who could enter killing trances at will also had to navigate the intricate politics of Constantinople. The psychological impact on the empire's enemies was profound. Arab chroniclers wrote in amazement about the northern demons who served the Byzantine emperor, warriors who combined the fighting skills of legendary Norsemen with the discipline of imperial troops. The reputation of the Varangian Guard spread across the Mediterranean, creating a deterrent effect that extended far beyond their actual numbers. In the Holy Land, during Byzantine campaigns to reclaim territory from Arab forces, the berserkers faced their ultimate test. Fighting in the scorching heat of the Middle Eastern sun, wearing heavy armor, they had to maintain their effectiveness against enemies who had never encountered anything like controlled northern fury. The battles were brutal, but the berserkers adapted, learning to trigger their trance states even in conditions that would have broken ordinary warriors. The empire learned to deploy them with surgical precision. Rather than using them as simple shock troops, Byzantine commanders integrated berserker units into complex tactical plans. They might hold them in reserve until the perfect moment, then unleash their fury at the exact point where enemy lines were weakest. The psychological impact was devastating. Disciplined Byzantine formations would suddenly produce howling, foam-mouthed warriors who seemed to materialize from nowhere. Harald Hardrada himself became legendary during his service with the Guard. He led berserker units in campaigns across the empire, from the mountains of Armenia to the coasts of Sicily. His ability to control and direct berserker fury while maintaining the discipline required by Byzantine military doctrine made him invaluable to successive emperors. The transformation was complete when these warriors returned north. They brought with them not just wealth and experience, but a new understanding of how individual fury could be integrated into larger strategic frameworks. The wild raiders who had terrorized Europe became sophisticated military leaders who understood both the power of controlled madness and the importance of disciplined organization. This was the pinnacle of berserker evolution. Warriors who had learned to harness their legendary rage while serving the most sophisticated military machine of their age. The beginning of the end came not with a single battle, but with a quiet revolution that spread across Scandinavia like morning mist. Christianity arrived in the north not as a conquering army, but as a new way of thinking that would prove more deadly to Berserker culture than any weapon forged by human hands. The conversion began in the courts of Norse kings who saw political advantage in adopting the religion of their southern neighbors. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, himself a former Viking raider, embraced Christianity around the year 995 and began systematically dismantling the old warrior traditions. The sacred groves where berserkers had conducted their rituals were cut down and burned. The priests of Odin, who had guided young men through their transformation into living weapons, were driven into exile or killed. But the real destruction came through the new moral framework that Christianity introduced. The Berserker tradition was built on the worship of Odin, the god of war and death, who promised eternal glory to those who died in battle. Christianity offered something radically different: salvation through peace, forgiveness through mercy, and eternal life through love, rather than violence. The very foundations of Berserker culture crumbled under this new philosophy. The Church actively worked to eliminate what it saw as demonic possession, masquerading as military prowess. Christian priests described Berserker rage as literal demonic influence, claiming that the foam-mouthed warriors were possessed by evil spirits rather than blessed by Odin's fury. They conducted exorcisms on former berserkers, attempting to drive out what they believed were demons that had taken control of these men's souls. New codes of chivalry began replacing the old warrior ethos. The Christian concept of the righteous warrior fighting to protect the innocent and serve God was fundamentally incompatible with the berserker ideal of seeking death in glorious battle. Knights were expected to show mercy to defeated enemies, protect non-combatants, and fight with honor and restraint. These values were the antithesis of everything berserkers represented. The last recorded berserkers appear in historical sources from the early 12th century, scattered references to warriors who still practiced the old ways in remote corners of Scandinavia. These final practitioners were often described as outlaws and madmen, remnants of a dying tradition that no longer had a place in the Christianized North. Some were hunted down and killed by royal forces. Others simply faded away as the culture that had created them disappeared. The Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 marked a symbolic turning point. King Olaf II of Norway, later canonized as Saint Olaf, died fighting to maintain Christian rule against pagan forces. The battle represented the triumph of the new order over the old. The victory of Christian knights over the last defenders of the warrior culture that had produced the berserkers. The age of controlled madness was ending. Organized medieval warfare itself had evolved beyond the point where individual fury could dominate battlefields. The rise of heavy cavalry, crossbow units, and sophisticated siege warfare made the berserker charge less effective than it had been in earlier centuries. Disciplined formations of professional soldiers fighting with standardized weapons and coordinated tactics could contain and neutralize even the most furious individual warriors. The transformation of Norse society from raiders to settled kingdoms accelerated the decline. As Scandinavian rulers established permanent territories and complex governments, they needed soldiers who could serve multiple roles: garrison troops, police forces, and diplomatic escorts. The berserker, trained only for battle and incapable of functioning in peacetime, became a liability rather than an asset. the economic changes were equally important. The Great Age of Viking raids was ending as European kingdoms developed better defenses and more sophisticated military responses. The wealth that had once flowed north from successful raids dried up, making it impossible to support the elaborate training and ritual systems that created berserkers. The cost of maintaining warriors who could only fight was too high for societies that needed farmers, craftsmen, and traders. But perhaps most importantly, the sons of berserkers chose different paths. Young men who in earlier generations might have sought transformation into living weapons instead entered monasteries, joined royal courts, or learned trades that would serve the new Christian kingdoms. The pipeline of recruits that had sustained berserker culture for centuries simply dried up. The sagas and stories kept the legend alive long after the last warrior had died. Icelandic poets and storytellers preserved tales of the foam-mouthed warriors who had once terrorized Europe. But these became entertainment rather than inspiration. The stories grew more fantastical with each telling, transforming historical warriors into mythological figures who bore little resemblance to the actual men who had weaponized madness in service of their gods. By 1200, the berserker had become a figure of legend rather than a living military tradition. The age of controlled madness was over, ended not by superior weapons or better tactics, but by a fundamental change in how Northern European society understood the relationship between war, spirituality, and human purpose. The berserkers vanished from history, but their impact on warfare echoes through the centuries. They proved that the human mind could be systematically conditioned to transcend normal limitations, that rage itself could become a precision weapon when properly controlled and directed. Military psychologists still study their methods, seeking to understand how ordinary men achieved seemingly superhuman abilities through systematic mental conditioning. Their mastery of psychological warfare influenced warrior cultures across the globe. The sight of foam-mouthed warriors entering controlled madness became the template for intimidation tactics that armies would employ for generations. They understood that breaking enemy morale was often more valuable than superior numbers or better equipment. The legend of the berserker lives on in our language and imagination, a reminder that human beings are capable of both transcendent courage and terrifying violence when pushed beyond normal limits. If you were captivated by this story of controlled madness and legendary warriors, hit that subscribe button for more epic tales from history's most feared fighters.